Hello everyone and welcome to the 7th lesson in our English language writing GCSE series. What we're doing in this series is we're basically going through everything that you need to know about creative writing and transactional writing so that hopefully you'll be able to achieve your potential in your GCSE language paper in terms of the writing. For most exam boards, it's about 50% of your English language GCSE that is assigned to your ability to write creatively, write transactionally. So let's start our lesson here. We've done 6 lessons before. Like I said, this is the 7th. So we've looked through a lot of creative writing principles that will help you: character arcs and narratives, the 5 senses, how to plan, which is something I call flesh and bones, some model answers. Last week, we started transactional writing. We looked through how to plan and do something called TAPS. If you haven't seen any of these videos, if you don't know what flesh and bones are, or you don't know how to plan well for this section, go back, check those videos out. I also do loads of literature videos, like gone through poetry and all of the major books for GCSE literature. So feel free to check any of those out if you find this content useful. So today's lesson, we're going to be going through the formatting, formality, and tone of your transactional pieces. So we need to think about obviously what those things mean. And then I've decided we're gonna read a little bit of different formats and formalities and stuff. So we've got 4 that we'll dive into a bit and think about a bit. So let's just very quickly think about what formatting is. Think about what, let me do a single T there, that's weird. What formality is and what tone is. Okay, so formatting, very simply, is really how you need to lay out your piece of writing on a page, okay? So if you're writing a letter, then obviously the formatting of that is going to be different to if you're writing a magazine article or a newspaper article or a speech or something like that, yeah? Now for current year 11s, you only have to worry about articles, yeah? As one of the small sort of changes the government made this year because of some issues, obviously, through the pandemic, you just have to do articles. Everyone else, my year 10s, my year 9s, everyone else, you will potentially do magazine article, newspaper article, letter, blog, speech. Those currently are the major 5, right? So you need to know a bit more formatting than the current year 11s. By the way, let's just do a very simple difference. Letter, you would do, your address. So you'd be like, Adam, blah, 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 Fake Street. Why would I do that? Of course, it would start with a number, 12 Fake Street, blah, blah, blah. Yeah. And then you would go over to the other side and you would do the name of your recipient, whoever's going to read the piece. So let's just call her Ms. Brown. And then you again would do a fake, fake address. And then you would start with Dear Ms. Brown, and then you would go into, I am writing to let you know, blah, 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 blah. Yeah, and you'd start writing. Hopefully yours will look nothing like this because this is just awful, but you get the idea. That is the format of a letter. And then at the end, you would put yours sincerely or yours faithfully, Adam, or whatever your name is. Obviously your name isn't Adam, probably. If your name is Adam, hey Adam. Anyway, so there you go. So that's the format. Whereas for a magazine article, you wouldn't do any of that, obviously. You would do just a headline. So ideally in big capital letters, you'd put headline in bold capital letters at the start, and then you would dive into your piece, right? So what you're showing the examiner is you understand the different formats, the different formatting. So that's really important. Probably the most important out of these 3 would then be the formality, yeah? So when we were talking about TAPS, we were talking about how different types have different formatting and different audiences have different familiarity and formality. So that's going to be a big part of what we dive into as we read these 4 different things: a letter to the Queen, a letter to a friend, a newspaper article, and a magazine article. We're going to look at how they're different formalities depending on the type of writing, but also depending on the audience, right? So in a nutshell, formality is, colloquially, you would basically say how posh you are in your writing. That's not literally it, obviously. It's basically, you know, how well spoken you will be, but yeah, how posh you are. So you instinctively know that if you're talking or writing to the Queen, you would talk and write to her differently than how you might talk to your best friend, right? Unless your best friend happens to be the Queen, in which case that's probably quite an odd. You're probably a 80 to 90-year-old person right now, and I'm not quite sure why you're on my video. But yeah, the formality is different depending on what you're doing, which audience you're writing to. Okay, and then finally, tone. So the tone of the piece is basically established by the subject of the piece. So if you're writing about something quite serious, like let's say illness, disease, war, something like that, then obviously your tone is going to be much more serious, right? And sincere. You're probably going to be making a lot less jokes. It's going to be just a heavier piece of writing. Whereas if you're talking about, you know, holidays, friendships, concerts, adopting an animal, whatever, summer, these are lighter topics usually. So they're going to be just a bit more uplifting, a little bit more just like breezy, right? So the tone is effectively how light or heavily you talk about the topic, how serious or light, etc. Okay, so let's dive into some different examples of formatting, formality, and tone. So the first one is a letter to the Queen. So it's a very formal, well, by the way, it's not actually really a letter to the Queen. It's more a guide on how to speak to the Queen. So there she is. And yeah, so there's all these rules basically to how to speak to the Queen. And I thought that that was kind of an interesting thing. You've probably never seen it. I've never even seen it. But the way that you are to address her and talk to her and stuff, I thought this would be quite interesting to just think about in terms of formality. Because the other way to think about formality, other than like how posh you sound, is effectively how rigid you are, right? How rigid the writing is. So the more formal, typically the more rules to the way you write. Okay, so unless you are personally known to the Queen or another member of the royal family, you should address your letter to the private secretary and equerry or a lady in waiting, asking for the subjects of the letter to be known, the letter be known to Her Majesty. So straight away, that's just kind of funky. Like you can't write directly to the Queen if you don't know her. Kind of makes sense, I suppose. But so it goes through her secretaries and whatever. That is one sign of formality. You're not going to do that in your piece. I suppose if you wanted to be really clever, you could say like, if it's an important person that you're writing to, you could maybe put the address as, you know, for the attention of the Queen through the Queen's secretary or something. That would really impress the examiner actually, because it's quite creative and a bit of fun. The letter should always begin and end with "Dear Sir" or "Dear Madam," and yours faithfully. And the envelope has to be written with the private secretary to the Queen, for example. For those who do wish to write directly to the Queen, the letter should begin "Madam" or "May it please your Majesty." The formality of this is amazing, right? "May it please your Majesty." It ends with, "I have the honor to remain, Madam, your Majesty's most humble and obedient subject," and then your name. Whew, look at the formality of this, right? The whole point of me reading this with you is not to tell you to write to the Queen, although maybe that would be kind of fun. It would be more because I want you to see how formal the rules are for formal pieces, how rigid they are. And you need to write in that rigid way if the formality of the thing you're writing is that formal and rigid. This is a very extreme example though. Within the body of the letter, do not use "you" or "your." Instead, use "your Majesty" or "your Majesties." Right. So, you know, this is the opposite of what I've taught with transactional writing. I encourage you normally to use direct address and speak to your audience with "you" and "we" and "us" and "our." If you're talking to the Queen or someone that you're unfamiliar with, it is technically impolite to do that. That's why a lot of languages like French and I think Spanish, and so I'm very good at English. I'm not that good at other languages, okay? But I think that's why they have two versions of "you" normally, right? So I think with French, there's like the familiar you and the formal you. I don't know what they are. If you do know, comment down below. I'd be interested to know. But technically, it's rude to call someone you don't know you, right? So there's the Queen one. And that's pretty crazy. So very formal, that one. Now we'll go to a letter to a friend. So this one is an example that a Learn English website had put up. So they're called learnenglishteens.britishcouncil.org. So shout out to them for this content. And I suppose shout out to the English Manor for the content on the Queen. Anyway, so you'll see immediately how familiar and informal this is by contrast, even though it's a letter. It has the right formatting of a letter, but it has also the right formality for the fact that the letter has been written as if we know the person. So, dear Sabrina, thank you for your letter. It was great to hear from you. You asked me to tell you about my favorite day of the week. Well, it's definitely Friday. So straight away, familiar, talking about yourself and what you like and asking about them. You can just see that that's totally different to what we talked about with the Queen, right? One reason I like Fridays is because I have my favorite subjects at school, PE and chemistry. Again, sharing details of life. Like, this is not something you would do with the Queen, unless you're that 90-year-old who's besties with the Queen. Hello to you if you're there. Chemistry is great because we do experiments in the science lab, and our teacher, Mr. King, is so funny. In PE, we usually play basketball, which is my favorite sport. I'm good at it because I'm quite tall. Our team usually wins. We also have French on Fridays, which is actually my least favorite subject. Having said that, maybe she'll be able to tell me about whether it's you familiar and you formal. I just can't remember. It's been 15 years since I learned French, maybe more. Anyway, after that, we have IT, which is much more interesting. At the moment, I'm creating a webpage for our basketball team, and after school, I hang out with my friends, and then in the evening, I play football at the sports center. Blah, blah, blah. Tell me about your favorite day in the next letter. I hope to hear from you soon. Love, Danny. Doesn't finish formally with yours faithfully or yours sincerely. Just says love, Danny, right? Because they're good friends. So the point is, hopefully you see the lack of formality here. So when you're looking at your TAPS, work out how formal it needs to be, and you're going to be somewhere between these two. This is very informal, right? So just try and nail the formality, because it will help with your mark if you get the formality right and the formatting right and the tone right. Also notice how light-hearted the tone was in that, because they're just talking about school and their lives. Okay, now we're going to get to something a bit more formal, but in a newspaper article. So year 11s particularly pay attention here really well. I tried to keep it neutral with the topic. I think that science is pretty interesting, and a lot of people would say that this is quite neutral topic. So it's not super heavy and serious. It's not super light either. So we have the there's so many. I just got dogs recently, as anyone who's watched any of my videos knows. So I guess that's why Amazon Basics is now going in here. And I live in Texas, so I suppose that's why that's there. Anyway, artificial bone and skin could give astronauts spare parts during dangerous missions to Mars, ESA says. So it's an interesting headline, yeah? And it goes into some detail which would help pique your interest as a reader. So that's the formatting of a newspaper article. Headline: 3D bioprinting may prove an integral part of astronauts' health as we look to terraform other worlds. That's just a little subheading. You don't have to do that. If you do want to do that, it is kind of impressive to the examiner, so it's not bad to do that. Okay. You don't have time to create a picture in your exam, but obviously newspapers and magazines often would have pictures. So this is an interesting picture. It's kind of creepy. I don't like looking at that in some ways, because that's a bit of bone that they've made that they might stick into a human being's body, and it just looks a bit freaky to me. But if it helps with space exploration, I'm all for that. So anyway, an artificial bone has been developed by the European Space Agency to give astronauts access to the spare parts that might be needed for long-haul space missions. The bone sample, what the heck? Okay. The bone sample is part of a set selection of items of the 99 objects of ESA-STEC website, which displays artifacts the agency has developed over the last 50 years. So straight away, what I want you to notice is, do you see how it's quite formal and objective. It's using facts, it's using statistics, it's got this register where it's not, I did this or I did that, or how are you? Or yeah, it's not familiar at all. It's journalism, right? The bone was developed using 3D bioprinting technology, with the ESA calling it an early step towards emergency medicine in space. As well as bone, it is possible this technology could also be used for skin grafts or to even generate internal organs. Nutrient-rich bio-ink made from the human blood plasma of the astronauts themselves could be obtained in -1 g of gravity. Serious burn injuries could involve a skin graft using muscle taken from another part of the patient's body. While this is capable on Earth, it's more difficult in space, and there is no guarantee that the secondary damage will heal perfectly. Right. You get the point. You get what I'm trying to say here, right? So the formality of this is not as formal as the Queen, but far more formal than the letter from a friend to another friend, right? It's a bit more objective in the way that it writes. It's not your opinion. It's not you doing this or I or whatever, right? It's more objective of like, this is what's going on and this is how it could be used. So as a writer, you're detached from this type of writing. And it's formatted in these smaller chunks that have different topics for the newspaper article, which again is perfect. So let's just finish up with one final one. This is a magazine article for a teenage magazine. So we've gone from a huge journalism, sort of journalistic body, The Independent, which is all different ages across a huge range of people read that, but it's mostly going to be a slightly older audience. It's not going to be teenagers as much. So it's this broader thing. So now we're focusing in on a little segment, basically teenagers specifically. And the way that this is written, you'll hopefully notice a difference again. So Alyssa Carson, the youngest astronaut in training, wants to make space for women in STEM. So this one's already a bit of a more light-hearted headline. So in The Independent, it literally just says, we might be able to make bones in space. This one has a little bit of a pun in it. It says that Alyssa Carson wants to make space for women in STEM. So obviously make spaces in create an area for women in space, but she's the first astronaut. So obviously make spaces in she's going to space, right? So it's just a bit more lighthearted straight away. We've got a subheading here as well. Nothing wrong with that. Like I said, you can definitely do that if you want to. I wouldn't necessarily expect that in a teenage magazine, but there you go, it's there. Now notice immediately how different this is. In college, I was one of the only women in my STEM track. In many classes, I was the only woman, period. To say it was a little lonely is an understatement. And often find myself wondering where all the other women in STEM majors were. STEM is for women too, right? Of course it is. Women are smart, curious, capable beings who want meaningful work that can afford them a very healthy means of living. Why is society telling us otherwise? So immediately we see that this is way less formal. It's written in more of a first person perspective. Now, admittedly, Alyssa Carson is the person writing this, yeah, but it's a much more familiar tone, and she is sort of an older, how old is she again? I think she's old, like young adult / old teenage age, right? And she's talking about when she was a full teenager, like 15 and so on. So it's a totally different format, it's the same format, but it's a totally different level of formality. It's using the first person. There's her opinion in here. There's also rhetorical questions in here. STEM is for timid. Well, that's actually not a rhetorical question because she answers it, but that she's using questioning in here. It reads totally differently. So this is obviously for a younger audience, less formal, more familiar. We'll just read one more paragraph of this. This one is Teen Vogue magazine, and if you wanted to read it all, you could just Google, I guess, Teen Vogue STEM Alyssa or STEM Carson, her surname, right? Rewind to my elementary school years in the early 2000s. I was 6 years old, living life, mastering how to kick around a soccer ball at practice, minding my own business, and bam, I learned about space. My mind was so blown that I remember asking my dad if space was real and if people had ever been there before. But from that moment on, I could never get enough. By the time I was 8, I set foot at my first space camp, and I've never looked back. I decided early on that space was for me, science was for me, and STEM was for me. But I couldn't be the only one. Where were all the other girls who shared my passion for science and STEM? While my early years at space camp were composed of a nearly equal number of boys and girls with no clear gender gap in sight, it didn't take long for me to witness the inevitable drop off, leaving me as one of the few girls standing in the room. Okay, so she's using anecdotes, she's talking about her personal life, she's putting in her opinions some more. And all of this is totally fine and appropriate for a magazine, which is less formal, and particularly a teenage magazine, which is therefore quite familiar. So there you have it. You've got 4 different types of writing there. So we had the letter to the Queen, letter to a friend. We had newspaper, which is obviously a broad audience, very formal and objective. So that's more like telling. And then a magazine for teenagers, which was quite a lot more informal and subjective. This was mostly Alyssa Carson's opinion. So I think that's everything I wanted to go through today. Basically, be careful of your formatting, your formality, and your tone. When you do your type, audience, purpose, subject, in your head, work out how formal it should be, how it should be formatted, and what the tone should be. And if you do that, I promise you will get a better mark in this part of the exam, no matter which exam board you're doing. All right, cool. That's everything for today's video. I hope that was helpful. If you like the video, give it a thumbs up, please. Any questions or comments, please do comment down below, and I'll see you in the next one.